try to remind you getting food, eating, etc. Just make yourself at home. This is the Global Issues Spring Lecture Series, and the focus of the lecture series for this spring is sustainability. And I'm leading off the lectures with my talk today. I want to let you know that a week from today, same time and place, Dr. Ostergaard Klim is going to be talking on the genuine progress indicator. She's doing some interesting work with the University of Hawaii. And then on the 13th, Dr. Leah Horowitz is going to be giving a talk on her research on the title, The Pact with the Devil, Customary Authority, World Heritage, and the Demise of Indigenous Protests in New Caledonia, and Leah is here with us today. And then on the 27th, Mr. Kelly Williams, a graduate student who is very active in green business activity and green investment, he's speaking. On the 3rd of April, Dr. James Prim, who has a project in Cambodia. He's got an orphanage project he's been working on there. He's going to talk about that. The title of his talk is Human Sustainability. On the 10th is Aquaponics in the Pacifics by David Wallfish, an enterprising young guy who has demonstration projects in the Pacific Islands on aquaponics, and is doing quite some innovative work there. On April 17th, Dr. Dana Rash is going to be talking about building a community co-op in Ecuador. Ideas for helping to build communities from the ground up. And Dr. Rash has been doing community development work for some years now in Ecuador. So, if you don't have a copy of one of these, I can send it to you electronically, or if you want to post it, I have a copy up here that you can take with you in public. Okay, I want to talk a bit today about what I see as the structure of the scientific revolution, of the sustainability revolution. I'll start with this quote by Gregory Bateson, that the problems we have in the world today are significantly a problem of thinking. And I use the term revolution because indeed it has been referred to as sustainability revolution, but I use the term primarily because it tends to engender a bit of intense focus. I mean, are we really in the midst of revolution? And I think we are. I want to talk to you about that a bit. There's a University of British Columbia professor named William Rees, who uses the phrase dual nature of humanity, and he talks about that from a sustainability point of view, and I want to share that idea with you. Basically, he's saying that we humans have a biological nature, and we also have a cultural nature, or what he calls a world view. Now, the important thing here is that from a biological perspective, we are influenced by our genetic code. That's an obvious one for you. From a worldview or a cultural perspective, we are influenced by something called memes, which are really kind of the cultural mores or beliefs that we hold. The problem that we have with this dual nature is that on the one hand, our biological nature is largely ignored and largely not paid attention to by our cultural nature. So we develop thinking habits, we develop cultural behaviors that run counter to our biological nature. And this causes conflict between the planet, our biological nature, and the world. Now, what I will spend some time doing now is talking about the nature of this conflict. I want to start with talking about the economic side, that is to say the cultural side of the conflict between our biological nature and our cultural nature. Come in, Barb. So, economically, we have learned in the past few decades, basically since the 1940s, to think about our economic well-being by using a single indicator called gross domestic product. Now, there are some problems with gross domestic product as we try to understand how to make a living on the planet. This particular measure has become commonplace in our language. It's used and discussed in discussions everywhere around the world today. And if you look at the newspaper, you see constant discussions and calls for further economic growth. So our attention is focused on growth as a singular measure of well-being. And what I've shown here is the world gross domestic product over time. And as you can see, it basically slowed down. The amount of gross domestic product has increased, but the rate of growth is slowing down. So our economics dominates our discussion. Our economics dominates our worldview in the modern sense. And to be successful at our economics, what we've done is put in place a production system that is used worldwide, that is used, what was used in the Cold War, and is a function of our focus on industrial, the industrial foundation upon which we go about making a living. The Russians used it, the communist countries used it during the Cold War, and we certainly have used it. And we'll call it a take, make, waste system. And the reason why we'll call it that is because nature, as the foundation for it, we extract and take from the natural world. We do something with that which we extract, and we produce something from that which we have extracted. And this is the basic system. Now, the problem that we have from a sustainability point of view is, if you look at the extract and the taking side of this model, we know that there is a tendency for economic actors to extract in ways that pay little attention to the cost of extraction, that engage in manufacturing processes in ways that pay little attention to the byproduct of those processes. And on the right-hand side is the production of something that we can use, but also the production of a prodigious amount of waste. Now, where does that waste go? It goes into the world commons, that is to say, into the air and into the water, into the soil. And the actors themselves do not have to pay for this, do not have to account for the contributions of the waste or account for the full cost of extraction. So this is the kind of model we put in place, where our economic engine is driven by GDP, by growing the economy, and we grow the economy with this industrial production system that externalizes cost as much as possible, as much as legally allowable, and sometimes more than what is legally allowed, onto the rest of us, onto nature and onto communities. That's the model that drives the global economy and has been driving the global economy since its inception, significantly since the end of World War II. So we can visualize the power of the economy, or the dominance of the economy, with this little graph. So it's more important than the world itself, And it's more important than the planet, more powerful. Our energies are focused on the economy. They're not focused on society. They're not focused on the world. They're focused on growing the economy. You recall after 9/11, and the economy shut down for 3 days, and Mr. Bush gets on national TV, and what kind of prescription does he offer to the American population? Do you remember, Carl?
Go shopping.
Go shopping. Get the economy humming again. Now, we know that there's an enormous number of consequences as a result of the impact of this economy on society. And we finally started waking up, thanks to a creative and courageous woman, Rachel Carlson, in 1964. Some of you perhaps know the book, Silent Spring, but calling our attention in the United States to the consequences of economic activity, particularly the use of chemical fertilizers in the ag business and the impact on the environment. And that's followed, the United Nations promoted the notion of Earth Day in the early 1970s, and that was followed by the U.S. with its version of Earth Day in 1970, and that's still a respected activity going on. I've highlighted here an important book that showed up in 1972 called Limits to Growth. I want to talk a bit more about that in a moment. But other catastrophes, environmental catastrophes, have happened around the world. 3 Mile Island and the meltdown nuclear generation plant problems, Union Carbide in Bhopal, and Chernobyl nuclear disaster in Ukraine in '86, Exxon Valdez in '89. These things may predate your birth even, but we could make an enormous list, catching you up to date. You can do that on your own because you're well aware of the environmental problems that we've had recently. But let's talk a bit about the limits to growth. 3 young doctoral students at MIT in 1970 were working under perhaps the world's foremost computer modeler, systems thinker, Jay Forrester. And they were commissioned by the Club of Rome to do a world model, to create a world model of the planet in 1970, and published this book in 1972. That has sold over 12 million copies and translated into 37 different languages. A very important book. But this is the model. This is a standard model, the run of their model. And you perhaps can't see it, so I'm going to point to some of the curves here. This is the year 2000, and this is pollution. You'll notice this is 2050, so these peaks are happening somewhere around 2030, 2040. The top curve there is resources, and you can see them declining. The next curve there on the left are birth rates falling and death rates falling, but then death rates increasing again about 2050. This is food per capita. This is industrial output, and this is population. So you can see from the model, when it came out in 1972, when the world was, particularly the United States, was on a fast train for economic growth, coming out of World War II. So when this book hit the market, terrific controversy around the book, tremendous controversy around the book, ridiculed by Chamber of Commerce everywhere. So what they did then was to write another book called Beyond the Limits, and 20 years later, in which they're saying, look, we've already shot past the limits of the planet. Now, the contributions of the Meadows book Meadows et al. Book, is to bring into our consciousness the concept of overshoot, which was not part of our economic conversation, and the concept of collapse. That is to say, systems can collapse, societies can collapse, biological systems can collapse. So to introduce those powerful terms into a worldview that is not wanting to hear them or not wanting to think about them led to a great deal of controversy. But they take their research a step further. In 2004, they published Limits to Growth, a 30-year update. A very popular book still today, and one we use in our program here at Hawaii Pacific University. Now, you might ask, what do people say about this modeling? The models of the Meadows research team. I could give you a list of academic studies that validate the model's research. That is to say, their modeling continues to be respected, and some people claim right on. So the other thing I'd like to call your attention to is the unusual longitudinal nature of this research. For academics to, over a 40-year period of time, be doing their research over a 40-year period of time to confirm their prior research is a very unusual bit of information for us. So what evidence do we have that the current system is unsustainable? If we are in the middle of a sustainability revolution, we can look back and say, or ask the question, what is it that's unsustainable that's leading to this question of how to become sustainable? Big issue, and you, I'm sure, are aware of it if you looking at even within the U.S., of course, the U.S. in terms of wealth gap problems, we're one of the leading countries in terms of wealth gap growth in the developed world. 80% of the world GDP is owned by 1 billion people, and 20% by the remaining 6 billion people. 1.4 billion living on less than $1.25 a day, and 1.6 billion living on less than $2.50 a day. 80 billionaires in the world, and with 178 added in 2008 alone. Unsustainability in the planet's ecology from the UN Secretary General in 2008. Every minute, 52 acres of tropical forest are lost, 50 tons of fertilizer, topsoil are lost, 12,000 tons of CO2 added to the atmosphere. Every hour, 1,700 acres of productive dry land turned into desertification. 250,000 tons of sulfuric acid falls in as acid rain, and 100,000 chemical compounds into the land, river, and oceans. Looking at water, fresh water diminishing, over 1/2 the world's population facing water shortages. 6,000 children die annually due to diarrhea. 1/3 of the world's population without a sufficient supply of water. And by 2025, 2/3 of the population facing critical water shortages. Land productivity. Over 7 billion acres of cropland for the world to use, and it's decreasing because of erosion and compaction and toxic salts and the leaching of nutritious elements, etc. So less land to feed a growing population. Now, if we take all these indicators, the question is, how do we make sense of all these indicators? And I've just shown you a few. And that question was tackled by a person named William Rees, a couple of people, Rees and Waddernagel at the University of British Columbia in 1996. They published this book, Ecological Footprint. And it's a measure of the resources that we humans need to support a given lifestyle. The current global ecological footprint is that we need about 1.5 Earths to support the current human population. And this graph shows in 1980 where our ecological footprint exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth. And you can notice the gap in the graph here as we go through time. The date here is 2010, so this is a little bit old data. Now, what it points to, what the ecological footprint points to is not imminent disaster, but it points to the kind of choices that we humans can begin to make. If we choose to continue as we have been, then we're going to end up with consuming 2 planets worth of resources. But if we begin to behave sustainably, we might be able to take the lower route and move the planet back into, move our economy back into planetary limits. Other indicators of impact from the World Wildlife Foundation Living Planet Index. Again, about 1980, you can see that the state of biodiversity on the planet has declined about 30%, pardon me, 1970. And that the decline has impacted both terrestrial, marine, as well as freshwater creatures. Come in. So, we know we're growing the population, currently at 7 billion and on the way to 8 billion by 2025 and probably 9 billion by 2040 or in that range. So what is the impact of the growth of human population on the planet in terms of the biology of the planet? This graph shows that rather clearly. That we humans are pushing other species aside. We're in the midst, as some have said, of the world's 6th great extinction. The previous extinctions not caused by humans, this one being caused by humans. Now, in addition to our economy, the economic system we've put in place that runs roughshod over the planet and shoots through limits is the question of what kind of energy regime have we put in place to drive this economy? And you know the answer to that. But the energy regime that we put in place gives rise to this kind of economic growth. It gives rise to kind of an exuberance around growth. So as you can see here, energy consumption over a long period, since starting about 1850 when we started using fossil fuel energy rather substantially. Notice the curve, an exponential curve. As we move through time, the growth increases. The supply of energy up until about 1997, the supply of energy increasing, but we are borderline energy peak. Certainly oil peak. We're in that neighborhood of an oil peak. this graph, I think, is particularly useful. All of the past discoveries of petroleum are shown by the blue. And the red line is consumption. And the green here are the possibility of future discoveries. In spite of all the rhetoric we hear around shale oil and fracking and so on, the amount of possible discovery is still quite small. But look at the consumption curve. Blowing past our discoveries, and at some point it will blow past the supply. The discoveries suggest what's available to supply. As a result of fossil fuel, look at what we've been able to do. The world passenger car fleet, exponentially growing. By 2050, 2.8 billion cars on the planet. That raises all kinds of questions that we won't go into because of time limitation, but just the question of infrastructure. Not to mention the use of combustion engines to power those cars. And we have yet to put in place any substantial alternative to fossil fuel to run our transportation fleets. So these, you've seen this before. And you know about CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. This is a study, the graph that just came up is a study done on the, where the measurements were taken on Mauna Loa in Hawaii starting back, all the way back 1960. So quite credible and highly referenced study. You can see the carbon dioxide accumulations in the atmosphere based on this particular study. Nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, increasing. Methane gas, 20 times more potent than CO2, increasing. Using fossil fuel-based fertilizers in our agricultural industry leads to the runoff of nitrogen into our rivers, which run into our oceans and give rise to plant growth, which reduces the oxygen in the water. So we call those dead zones. And there are a growing number of dead zones worldwide, around 450 dead zones on the planet today. Some huge. One out of the Gulf of Mexico, perhaps you're aware of it. The Gulf of Mexico, where the Mississippi River runs into the Gulf of Mexico. Species extinctions, as I mentioned earlier. So the connection between our economic model that we use and the type of energy we use are closely correlated variables, as shown by this graph. If we lose our energy source, what happens to our economic source? And the connection between the food that we humans produce for ourselves and oil and fuel. Oil prices go up when we do eventually run out of oil, and the price of oil goes up. That's going to happen. Then we've already had some examples of oil price increases, food price increases, and the following food price increase. And I suspect you probably have experienced some food price shocks yourself just in the past 4 years. The other impact of our economic activity on the planet that's important has to do with the food that we're capable of producing as we exploit the soils and allow for soil runoff and desertification to increase, our ability to produce grain starts diminishing. I call your attention to the per capita grain production here, going forward into 2015. That the amount of food we're producing, grain we're producing per person is decreasing. Now, you say, so what? Well, so what is? It leads to food insecurity, and that creates problems within social systems, and so on. So the world energy demand going through 2035, the blue is the non-organization countries, non-organization for economic cooperation and development countries. You can see with the developed world, the red somewhat stable, but China and India and Brazil and Russia coming online for energy demand is going to continue to drive up our need for energy. So all of these things pulled together and has led to the introduction of an idea promoted by the geophysical societies that we're no longer in the Holocene period, geological period, but now into a new era called the Anthropocene period, the age in which humans dominate nature. I just want to mention here a well-known American academic, author, journalist, Bill McKibben, who 2 years ago wrote a book called Earth. You'll notice the spelling of the book with 2 A's. And he intentionally wrote it, spelled it like that, to signify humans changing the planet. That we are now inhabiting a planet that's different than the one that we knew just a couple of decades ago. So if you want to kind of contrast and compare the economic system we have with nature, it looks something like this. We know our economy runs on finite sources of energy, fossil fuels, and nature runs on an infinite source of energy, sunlight. We might say a clean source of energy. The economy depends on continued growth, and nature seeks a dynamic equilibrium, a more steady state. The economy creates waste, nature recycles everything. The economy is built around competition, nature fosters cooperation and interdependency. The economy promotes standardization. You know, nothing better than a global product like Coca-Cola, because everybody knows it. You don't have to vary the advertising in different markets. Nature promotes diversity. The economy focused on global markets. Nature focused on local enterprise. The economy overshoots limits by growing exponentially, and nature values and respects limits, sustainable growth over time. So, how is all of this changing our thinking? And we see evidence of the changes in thinking by the sheer controversy associated with sustainability and environmental movement, and so on. The question of economic growth. Well, one important dimension, of course, are us. The other important dimension of the planet today is the economics, the way in which we go about making a living on the planet, and the planet itself. So you can see this is a move away from a focus on economic activity and economic growth in our discussion, in our narrative. And we have to now begin to look at the relationship between people and economics and the question of equity, because we cannot continue with the tremendous wealth gaps that are appearing around the world. The question of the livability of the planet. If you were on the East Coast during, or you can imagine the livability impact of Sandy on people living on the East Coast, or the heat waves throughout the Midwest this past summer, and the droughts in the Southwest. Question of livability. And the question of viability, the need to be able to make economic profit while considering both people and planet. And this is what we call sustainability. Now, this is one way to think about sustainability. So it moves us much beyond just the question of economic growth. It moves us beyond simply thinking about the question of livability and the simple question of economic equity. I want to talk to you just briefly about another model. And this is one put forth by a well-known author named Jeremy Rifkin, known initially in 1980 for his book Entropy. But he calls it Third Industrial Revolution. And he says some things here I think are instructive and useful for us as we think about how in the world do we move into a more sustainable future. What do we need to be doing? What kind of policies do we need? And he calls it distributed capitalism. And there are 5 pillars. And I must tell you also at the beginning, before I go into his model, is that he works closely with the European Union and very closely with the German government and the French government to implement this model. And European governments tend to be moving ahead quite rapidly compared to the United States in terms of alternative fuels and so on. The first part of his model is that we must shift to renewable energies and stop the foot dragging, stop the denying the need, but move to renewable energies as quickly as we can. And this is where I find his model quite fascinating. Number 2. Transforming buildings everywhere into micro power plants to collect renewable energies on site. In other words, get solar panels on all of our buildings and start collecting energy, free energy, clean energy on all of our built infrastructure. And then, in addition to that energy collection, is deploy hydrogen and other storage technologies that can store this renewable energy. So here's kind of how it works. Collect the surplus energy, and you have a relationship with the energy, with the public energy companies to sell the energy back or to do an exchange of energy. When you need the energy, you use the solar energy. When you don't need the solar energy, when you have a surplus, it goes back into the central supply. And then you have an account, and that can then be drawn when you need it. And that excess energy can then be used to produce hydrogen, which is a controversial idea because producing hydrogen using fossil fuel energy is quite expensive. But if we're creating a surplus of free, clean energy, we can use that surplus to create hydrogen and then to store that hydrogen so that the hydrogen becomes an alternative source of energy when the sun don't shine, for example. And then this is already happening, and it's happening here to some extent, using internet technologies to transform the power grid. So we get a sharing arrangement going on everywhere with energy. And then transition our transportation fleets to electric plug-in and fuel cell. I have friends who have solar panels on their house in Kailua, and they have sufficient solar panels to where they now run a Chevy Volt on the energy they produce from their solar panels. And basically, transportation cost is free. They report 3 gallons of gas used in December for driving they do in their boat. So the technology is there. Rifkin's model, I think, is one we need to begin to pay attention to. There's one other little bit of information I want to talk to you about. This comes from Rolling Stones magazine in July 2012, entitled Global Warming's New Terrifying New Man. It was written by Bill McKibben, the author of Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H. 3 numbers. First number, 2 degrees Celsius is the limit that scientists have agreed to is the maximum limit for loading up for global warming. We're currently at about 0.8 degrees Celsius. And the leading economies, wealthy economies, the G8 agreement in 2009 said we got to stay under 2 degrees Celsius. And it's a controversial number because scientists say, no, that's way too high. But the politics of global warming push the ceiling. James Hansen, a name you perhaps know, the NASA scientist, says 2 degrees Celsius is a prescription for long-term disaster. But that's what we're headed for. From a political point of view, that's the politics. 2 degrees. And then McKibben says, let's take a look at the second number he thinks is real important, is that to go from 0.8 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius, we can load up 565 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere by 2050 and still stay close or under 2 degrees Celsius. Interesting thing is, though, the current rate of loading up the atmosphere, the CO2 is 3% a year, will reach 565 gigatons by 2028. So we're going to get there quicker than we thought. We're going to fill the capacity, the alleged capacity of the atmosphere to accumulate CO2 and not go above 2 degrees Celsius. But then his third number, which he says is really the terrifying number. If we look at the fossil fuel on the books of the oil companies and on the countries like Kuwait and Venezuela, on the books as an asset are fossil fuels they're going to burn. It's their assets. 2,795 gigatons owned by these companies and countries that are going to be burned. Now, 5 times as much oil and gas planned to be burned beyond the 565 limit. So you see the pressure in the system that these economic actors have assets that they are going to make money on. That's what they're in the business for. And they're going to burn those. As soon as as supply begins to, as demand begins to put pressure on the supply. I'd be happy to send you a PDF of that article. It's kind of a frightening article. Okay, so all of this together. Questions of energy, questions of the economy, questions of overshooting. What are we to do? How do we move into a sustainable world? And I started out by saying it is a thinking problem. And I think we can figure out perhaps a model that would point towards moving into sustainability. So I want to share that model with you. called a funnel model. We have the biosphere and society in that biosphere. We know that society is systematically reducing the biosphere's potential to support life. We know that society is increasing resource depletion and environmental damage. In short, the system is unsustainable. We know that the resources on the planet are in decline. That's the upper downward sloping straight line. And that the population and consumption factors on the planet are increasing. That's the upward sloping straight line at the bottom. So a declining supply of resources and capacity of the planet to absorb our waste, and an increase in population and the tendency of the population to consume. I didn't speak about the rising middle class around the world and the coming online of China and India in terms of middle class status. So this is the funnel that we got to go through to get to a sustainable society and a sustainable biosphere. We're going to have to regenerate the biosphere and create sustainable organizations and societies. So we can end up with something that looks a little like this. In the center there is leadership and education for sustainability. And the sustainable relationships between the earth and the atmosphere and the biosphere. We have the technology to do this. It is a question of will and a question of getting to it. Now, on the downside, what people are saying, experts, supposed experts, are saying about what happens when we go through this funnel. Because you can see the reduction, the visual tendency to go through a funnel is to shrink. Jorgen Randers, one of the authors of Limits to Growth, currently professor at Norwegian School of Business, just written a book called 2052, says that going through this funnel is going to be costly. Probably 1 billion people will lose their lives, and considerable disruption and migration and insecurities created by the dilemma of having to back off of the economic growth and the energy system that we are so addicted to today. Randers is not the only one. And this is coming up according to a multitude of forces, a couple of decades or thereabouts. Time is getting closer. Now, I have a couple of minutes. Let me also, this is a response by the United Nations in light of all of this concern about the changes upon us. The United Nations in 2000 took it upon themselves to address many of the issues caused by overshoot, eradicate hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equity and empowerment of women, reduce child mortality, improve material health, combat FIH, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and develop global partnerships for development. Pretty noble set of objectives, yes? 170 odd countries behind these objectives. how much longer do we have to fulfill them? A couple of years. And the record is showing we're not doing all that good. In some places we're doing better than others, but generally speaking, it doesn't look like we're going to meet these goals. So just some other things happening that you are part of, and try to bring this home to HPU and bring it home to what's happening in higher education, which you are a part of. 2005, an organization was started called ASHE, Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. So higher education institutions that are concerned or interested in sustainability become members of ASHE, and I'm happy to tell you that HPU is a member of ASHE. In the economics world, one of the main drivers of the problems we have, the profession of economics, using models and thinking that are limited in terms of paying attention to environmental and the impact on communities, mostly focused on bottom line, is CASI, the Center for the Advancement of Steady State Economics. In communities, a lot of innovation, transition towns, perhaps you've heard of it. And in business, B Corps and generative ownership models. And then finally there's HPU. And what we're doing here, and I don't know if you know it, but we have a campus sustainability coordinator who is involved in a variety of sustainability initiatives across campus. And we are moving sustainability into the curriculum in a variety of ways. We have a master's program in global leadership sustainability, some of you know about. And I just heard that general education at HPU has adopted sustainability as a new dimension of general education, so we will begin to start teaching sustainability to incoming students. Leave a little time for conversation. Yeah, Leah.
I just can't, hi, I just wanted to point out that there is actually a critique art of which you may be aware of the limits to growth as a model. It's kind of, it's quite neo-Malthusian in the sense that it takes the notion that that population will surpass our ability to care for that population with the resources available to us. But as you may be aware, that has been proven to be false again and again. We're quite ingenious as a species, and we've been able to overcome those limits at every turn. You may be aware of the bet placed between Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon back in 1970, I believe it was, that due to scarcity, certain resources and commodities would reach very high costs, very high prices. Well, Paul Ehrlich bet that they would. Julian Simon actually allowed him to choose those prices that he thought that they would reach, and Julian Simon won, and Paul Ehrlich had to pay him $1,000 because they didn't reach those prices. We were able to overcome those seeming natural limits. Now, what it turns out is that we have this technological, the problem is not technological, okay? And the solutions are not technological. We have the technology. It's out there. We know what to do. We know we have wind, we have solar, we have all that. It exists. The problem is political and economic. The problem is a question of distribution of resources. The resources are there. The intellectual resources are there. The physical resources are there. They're not being distributed. Because we have a political and economic system that caters to the wealthy elites. Okay, so what I'm saying is that the limits to growth model is actually has been surpassed. We know that the problem is not technological; it is political and economic. And as long as, sadly, as long as there is a capitalist system in place, it will always favor the rich getting richer and passing on the externalities, the costs, to the poor, who are not able, who do not have the political clout and the economic power to defend themselves. So that's just some food for thought. I have to go.
Thank you, Leah. Yeah, I would agree that it's largely a political problem that we're having. Other comments? Yes. Hi.
Hi, how's it going? My name's Cody, by the way. I understand everything that is being said here, and it seems like it makes sense for a country like ours or other Western or world domination countries. But I mean, it does become, yeah, the technology's there for us, but it does become a problem. And I kind of see the funneling aspect of what you were saying in the opposition argument, in that the countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait that are so solely based off natural resources, what are they to do when this process begins to take place? I mean, that would be, I guess, a concern of mine. I'm not against going green and sustainability, but those nations that are so highly dependent on natural resources would definitely become a question.
Well, what are they doing? Do you know? In anticipation, some of those countries are rapidly installing photovoltaic and engaging in a variety of water-saving devices. So, because they live in the desert. Can they do it quickly enough? Dr. Holowitz's comment, I think, is an important comment. The question is, of course, it's a political thing. We have the technology. We know how to fix the problem. But are we going to do it in time? There's a tendency in the human species, there's a tendency in all of us to focus on short-term issues, on how to figure out a way to make a living in the short term. Where's our next meal coming from? The biological drive for reproduction is all kind of a short-term consideration. To think long-term, to think 2 decades from now, or 10 years from now, is something that we're not wired to do. It takes a conscious act of will. It takes information to do that. I think, the model I showed you, the funnel model, I think is a model for education. My goodness, could we begin to build a curriculum around that model so that we begin to link society with the environment, with the economy, so that students come out with an understanding of how these forces interact. Right now, we're organized in disciplines and around subject matter. We're not organized interdisciplinary. We don't give enough, not much anyway. So I think the educational implications are enormous. I kind of strayed from your comment and concern about the Middle East, but yeah. Other comments? I think we're out of time. We got students waiting, and we're supposed to be done at 10 to 12. So thank you all for coming. And if you have an interest in any of these slides or any of the references I put on the screen, let me know, and I'll get to you with them. I can be, I'm in room 303 here, and my email address is standardhpu.edu, awhatley@hpu.edu. Thank you for coming. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Give me your email address and your name. WHAT.